As you listen, keep in mind that though this podcast features medical and other professionals and regularly speaks on the topic of psychoactive substances in a positive light, nothing heard here should ever be taken as medical advice or as encouragement to consume any of the substances mentioned, especially the ones that are blatantly illegal in your country of residence. Listen critically and always check in with yourself before acting based on anything you hear or read on the internet.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of ATTMind Radio, and unfortunately another episode without the video due to some bandwidth problems, but quality is quality if it's audio or video, so I'm looking forward to offering this interview anyways. Before we get into it, I'm going to make a quick announcement, which is that if this interview comes out on the time frame that I believe it's going to, I'll have recently released an article called Healing in Love, to know the pain of too much tenderness, about what it means to go into past emotional traumas left over from heartbreak within a new relationship and how to navigate vulnerability in new loving relationships to mutually with each other become stronger and increase intimacy and just general emotional health, releasing things that were once perceived as being properly integrated, but then when new love comes along and the vulnerabilities trigger again, you realize that a lot of that stuff wasn't actually addressed because it wasn't applied in new loving. So that's the article. The link will be on my website, jameswjesso.com, so just head over there and check that out if you're into reading about love and healing. Another announcement is that, as many of you know, if you've been following this podcast, is that I have launched a Patreon campaign. So if you like this podcast, if you've been enjoying it and you'd like to directly support it with a little bit of a financial boost, you can head over to my Patreon page by going to jameswjesso.com/support, and all the links are there. And you can donate or pledge a reasonable amount once a month, $1, $2, $3, $5, $10 towards the podcast and towards my essays and stuff. And it'd be a great way to express your gratitude if you were positively receiving these podcasts and my other work. Now, getting into the interview, I've got Dr. Douglas Tataryn here today. Dr. Tataryn received his Ph.D. in clinical psychology in 1991 and was a full-time research professor at the University of Manitoba from 1991 to 2001. Excuse me. Publishing theoretical and empirical papers in psychology, community health sciences, and research methodology. He has been in full-time private practice since 2001, specializing in clinical therapy using the Bio-Emotive Framework, which is something we're going to talk about today, life coaching, sports, and corporate psychology. Dr. Tataryn has also studied and practiced meditation for over 30 years and conducts seminars on emotional well-being, uses stress to promote health and healing, integral theory, performance enhancement, and the integration of psychology and spirituality. Welcome to the show, Douglas.
Thank you, James. It's wonderful to be here and talking to you.
So we met in Winnipeg, 2 years ago. About a year ago, almost to the day. Within a couple months.
I don't remember the details that closely, but I think it was about a year. I think it was you were giving a talk at a local cafe, if I remember right.
Yeah, the bookstore cafe.
Yeah, I think one or two of my kids had been interested in what you were doing, and I was interested in as well. This was your talk on. Do you remember what it was?
Yeah, it was a series that I was doing when I was traveling across Canada, which was basically me going off on my story of working with entheogens and talking about, I think, cultural taboos and the importance of refining and upgrading open social discourse on psychedelics. Yeah, actually, we met at a store through a mutual friend, a herb store, and we started chatting. And you and I got into it, and you started talking about your work, and it really intrigued me because it seemed to just resonate so beautifully with what I had been doing with my work around psilocybin mushrooms. And and then I got into your stuff when I started exploring the Bio-Emotive Framework. Of course, that's why I have you on the show. Now, to start it off right away, now this is a term that might be new for a lot of the listeners and maybe not, but I'm going to ask you, what is cultural alexithymia? I guess, what is alexithymia, and how does it play into the health of an individual and the health of a society?
Well, good questions, and I'm going to. The alexithymia is a notion that we use in psychology to talk about, I guess, usually a particular individual is having trouble or great difficulty processing and expressing their emotions. And actually, a lot of the research was done in Toronto, and there's a fellow put together Toronto Alexithymia scale. And if you give it to 1,000 people and score it, according to that scale, about 15%, 10 to 15% of people will suffer from alexithymia, meaning they have trouble experiencing and or expressing their emotions. Now, I'm using the term a little differently than that, actually very differently, because when I went into clinical practice and I started seeing people, I was very interested in how their emotions affected their mental health conditions, because I had actually spent a lot of time doing biofeedback research and having people hooked up to a polygraph where they could, I was doing therapy with them while I could monitor their heart rates and their temperature and their GSR, their galvanic skin response. So I could look at all their unconscious indicators. And the words coming out of their mouth seldom matched what was going on in their body. So I'd ask them a question, I'd get this huge autonomic response, and then they'd say, no, I'm fine, there's nothing there. And that notion that we're not aware of the unconscious, or what I've come to really just talk about is the emotional part of us, showed up a lot when I was seeing clients. I would guess that, well, when I would ask people just how are you feeling, and be serious about them answering that question, very few people could actually do it. The longer I focused on it, the more clear that people were either giving me stories or telling me kind of what was going on in their body, but they seldom told me what they were feeling. And, well, I guess I just continued pursuing that thread. My take on it is that in terms of the cultural alexithymia, even though the research says about 15% of people don't process their emotions well, I'm guessing it's more like 85-90% of people don't process their emotions well. And that's a different take on it than most psychologists, but it fits my experience, and that's part of what happened with the Bio-Emotive Framework. Why don't you ask me a question or something, because I'd like to focus on what do you think of what I've said so far?
Yeah, I think it's important. I personally believe that the ability to feel into your emotions in a way that enables you to, I guess, own and understand and integrate them through properly communicating them. I think the ability to say, I am feeling this, and the this that you're describing have a very resonant feeling tone in the body. is a point that, though can be quite challenging and often quite uncomfortable, is also a process of owning those emotions in a way that allows you to integrate them more effectively later. And you made a comment there about people's bodies responding to a question in a way that it was like, whoa, the autonomic nervous system, and maybe we can get in a little bit later on polyvagal theory, if you're familiar with that at all, but the autonomic nervous system responding to this question, but the mind seemingly like, oh no, I'm fine. and I wonder about what role, and this is the question, I wonder what role dissociation from physical experience is playing in this cultural alexithymia and in the ability for people to properly experience, express, and integrate emotions. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, and that's actually something that we mentioned earlier in the before we formally started talking. The triune brain, I think, actually speaks to this really well. And this is a theory that I kind of started developing on my own, and then found out that a fellow named Paul MacLean actually wrote about it in the 70s and 80s, and he was a really great neuropsychologist. And he proposed that that inside our skull, we actually don't have one brain, but three fairly independently functioning brains. And I'm not going to use his words because I think they're a little bit too technical, but basically we have a physical brain, an emotional brain, and an intellectual brain. And those three modules have evolved over time, and they can act fairly independently. So a lot of the sort of tensions that we feel in our life often map onto one of our brains wanting to do one thing and another brain wanting to do something else. So if you look at, say, the commercial, I bet you just can't eat one, like the potato chips, that basically says you eat one and you're going to stimulate your physical brain to want to get more salt in it. And no matter how you feel about what you're eating or what you know rationally about what you're doing, your physical brain wants to continue eating that because it's salt, and we're kind of biologically programmed to put salt in our body. So that notion of dissociation often maps on nicely to one of our brains being dominant and the other two not really being that well integrated, which is also how I see the alexithymia in our culture, where the emotional module of our brain really is not encouraged or nurtured, right? If you look at our, say, our school system, we spend like literally the first 12 years training our intellect to think and do logic and mathematics and get history down.
You mean the first 12 years of the schooling system, not the first 12 years of life?
Yes, good clarification. And we'll be look at all the time we spend on sports, and physical skills. We put lots of formal, explicit training into the intellect and the physical brains, but how much training did you get on the emotional brain?
I got very little training from my from my teachers and stuff, but I imagine I got a lot of really defunct training trying to figure it out with my other adolescent friends.
Yeah, and in fact, if I'm a little older than you, but it was actually explicitly discouraged or even suppressed. When I started to cry, I was told, stop crying. Right? I wasn't asked, how am I feeling? I was told, stop crying. And that's, that basically suppresses the emotional system. And if you look at our culture, there's all sorts of evidence of that. I use the example of, say, anxiety. I go so far, and this is fairly controversial, again, like the way I'm using culture, like alexithymia. This is not how mainstream psychologists see it, but with anxiety, what are the symptoms of anxiety, James? Like when you think of someone having anxiety, what do you think about?
Excuse me. Physiologically, I think of increased heart rate. I think of physical symptoms like shaking, or like racing thoughts, racing heart rate, increased sense of being on edge, sweating palms. Yeah, tendency to like very quickly emotionally react to things in sort of like an inappropriate fashion, compulsive or impulsive behaviors. Yeah.
Yeah. And when you look at that, all of the symptoms that you're describing, the physiological symptoms, are symptoms of emotions, right? And what we do with anxiety is we give a person permission, or we train them to focus just on the physical symptoms of what's going on, and say, okay, well, you need to do some breathing exercises, right? You need to calm your body down. But we don't ever say, you're emotionally activated, what are you feeling? And yet, that seems to be what's going on with anxiety. Either they're in an explicit fear state because, they're threatened physically, which is rare, or they're actually, what I've come to believe is they're afraid to feel the feelings that would make them cry if they felt them. And so they just focus on the physiology of what's happening. And they don't ever turn it into an actual, what am I feeling? Because as soon as you do that, it's a totally different relationship to what's happening. Right? So if you look at, say, public, fear of public speaking, people will have an anxiety around that. What do you think might be going on for a person who's got an anxiety around public speaking?
Well, the immediate things that come up would be to be in a public recognition of your inadequacy, and then to feel shame or disempowerment, like inadequacy, but to feel shame in yourself, and then in that be acknowledged as being inadequate in a public way.
Beautiful. And that's the feeling-based approach to anxiety. And we never actually talk about that. That's not what we do when we talk about someone having an anxiety condition and we help them get over it. We always just talk about, well, let's do some breathing exercises and things like that and calm you down, or we'll try and talk ourselves out of having those feelings and beliefs.
Mm-hmm. I do think that the breathing exercises can be really great because, the way this conversation is unfolding, I'm thinking about anxiety as these emotions that are wanting to come up. And I think this is playing into the dissociation thing, which I'm going to ask you again and kind of lean in another direction here too, which is that these emotions start to come up and we start to use different techniques to suppress those emotions. And then over time, our ongoing process of doing that, it's like the nervous system starts to glitch out and it can't handle the continued repression. And so we get into these anxious states, which is the body, like you said, responding to threat. We go into these sympathetic nervous system responses, and all this threat comes up. And typically this would enable us to, climb trees really fast and run and fight saber-tooth tigers or whatever we needed to do. But instead, it's just this general sense of impending threat. And the threat is the body kind of freaking out, something's wrong. And what's wrong is that these emotions need to come out in a healthy way, but they're being held in, or they're being avoided. And the breathing exercise, I think, would be good to relax enough so to relax out of the anxiety, and then from there into the emotions. So you can get out of the anxiety and into the tears, right? Or out of the anxiety and into saying, okay, so now that I'm not trapped in this this very low cognitive, higher executive cognitive function, so I can't turn myself towards my emotions because I'm so stressed. You can get out of that and into what's actually happening here and relax into it. And so the question that I'm leaning in towards, back into dissociation, is about the techniques that we use to block emotions, to protect ourselves from uncomfortable emotions because of, say, operant conditioning, or just other types of being explicitly told, like, this is not good, don't feel this way. What are some of the techniques that we use to block our emotions, and how does that play into the psychological dissociation from the physical experience of emotions?
Okay, that's a big question, and I'm going to just frame that you're talking about dissociation as a way of not processing the emotions, and that there's also two other really common ways of not processing our feelings and emotions, and one of them is distraction. That's just a straight behavioral. I'm going to turn on the TV, or I'm going to go eat some food, or I'm going to go do something, and we distract ourselves. The dissociation is common, and it's a little bit different than repression, right? And do you make that distinction when you think about repression and dissociation, or do you see them as fairly similar? Because I wasn't sure how you're using them.
Yeah, it really depends, right? Because dissociation is like you don't feel it at all. It's almost like your nervous system becomes so overwhelmed that it has a series of options, right? And in those options, this is leaning into the polyvagal theory of Stephen Porges, is that when you get to this really anxious place, then your options are either to mobilize, which is the distraction, or to immobilize, which is to dissociate, just like push that away, don't even acknowledge that it's there. And that isn't even something that happens consciously. That's something that happens on a more back-end operation. And then repression is something that you actively are like, no, I am not going to feel this. So it's a more conscious act. Does that feel
close?
Am I interpreting it?
Yeah, that's close. I actually, I would say that repression is suppression automated.
Okay.
Right? So that we start off intentionally trying to suppress the feelings, but then after a couple episodes, it becomes automated, and we start actually doing it without realizing it. And I'll actually come back to that, because I wrote a paper on that phenomena back in '84 as an undergraduate, and it's still something I use today to think about what's going on. But before we do that, I'll go back to dissociation. The dissociation I actually have found useful to think about the triune brain, so that our sense of self, when I ask people sort of where they would locate their sense of self if they had to point to some part of their body, and I'll usually do a couple minutes of exercise to get them centered and aware and breathing, and then I'll say, can you, with your eyes closed, please point at where you would put your sense of self. And people will either point at their forehead, they'll point at their hearts, or they'll point at their bellies. And those three things actually correspond really well to the triune brain. The belly being my physical existence, the heart being my emotional existence, and the head being my intellect. And we actually have those kind of types in our culture, right? The artsy kind of people, the physical jocks, and we've got the intellect, the nerds. And I think that I see dissociation as when under stress, our sense of self actually takes refuge in one of those modules completely and doesn't allow the sensations of the other ones to come in. So if I'm really emotionally overwhelmed, I've seen people go into their intellect and they just become hyper rational, and they talk about their feelings, but they won't feel them.
Well, intellectualizing, that's one of Freud's original egoic defense mechanisms. Yeah.
Yes, and it can be taken to the extreme where it's actually a kind of dissociation. And the other thing is, I've seen people go into the physical sensory world, and they'll suddenly start talking about looking at the ceiling or looking out the window or the sensations in their body, but they don't actually, they're not experiencing any of the emotional trauma that's actually taking place in that moment. So the three modules seem to work well, that under extreme conditions, we just pop into one of those kind of modules of our brain and process from there and ignore the processing in the other. And that's a kind of dissociation. With the repression, what I did some research, and back in the 30s and 40s, there was a lot of research done on the relationship between posture and mood, and they were looking at the muscles and how that affected, emotional states. And ultimately, there's about 15 years of research which concluded that muscle tension interferes with cognitive processing. Any kind of task that people were doing, whether it was mathematical or perceptual acuity or puzzles, all went down as people's muscles got too tense. And they made sure that it wasn't any other processes. It was actual muscle tension. They just did a whole bunch of research to sort of rule out other possibilities. And so if you look at that, muscle tension interferes with cognitive processing, and then you imagine what happens when most of us get emotionally upset. Is it okay to cry in most situations?
It really depends on sort of the cultural demographic that you live in. But I would say, if I were to make I see where you're going with this, the general tone is that for the most part, it isn't appropriate to show emotions that distract from productivity and a seemingly mundane, everything's okay paradigm in a public place, and then sometimes even in a private place as well. That's not welcomed or positively accepted or held in a way where it's supportive, but instead held in a way where it can be actually quite unsupportive and further damaging to express your emotions.
Yeah, particularly in public places, like at work or in restaurants, you just don't see people crying, and yet a lot of people have things happen to them where they're really upset. And so if we don't want to express our emotions, the first thing that we can do is take a breath and hold it, right? And clench up our body. So if you're about to break into tears and you imagine that you don't want to do that, tell me which parts of your body get tense, or how do you suppress that expression?
Well, personally, I'm quite aware of the process in myself, and I actually try to allow myself to cry. But what I notice is that there's this training in my body that I have to sort of like try to overcome, which is an immediate, like you said, like breath holding and a tension that's placed in like my upper chest and in my throat area, almost as if to hold it down from coming up from my belly. And then my process is to try to breathe and relax and almost like allow it to well up from where the tension is, to well up towards my face so that it can come out through tears and it can come out through sobs and such. So yeah, I feel that tension coming up in my upper chest area and in my throat.
Right. And based on what you've just said, I would say that somewhere in your history, often when we're a young child, you intentionally held your breath and clenched your abdominal muscles and your throat, squeezed your throat to stop yourself from making any sounds of crying.
My parents have told me that when I was younger, if I got really upset, I would hold my breath. And once I even fell over because I was holding my breath for so long.
Wow.
Interesting.
That's a little more extreme than I've normally come across. But it's that when you did that intentionally to suppress the expression of your emotions, you accidentally went into a conditioning loop where the actual act of tensing the muscles not only stopped the expression, but it interferes with the experience of the emotion. And so if you were highly upset, tensing your muscles actually brought you to a lower state of upset. And so it just got reinforced. And then if you relax your muscles because you've calmed down, but you've still got the stimuli that upsets you in the room or something, and you start to feel the emotion again, and you don't want to, well, now because your muscles have stopped interfering with the emotion, when they relaxed, you just punished relaxation. So we've got this interesting set of contingencies where tensing your muscles in the presence of an emotional upset that you don't want to feel is reinforced, and relaxing your muscles is punished because you start to feel more. And after 3 or 4 conditioning trials like that, it becomes an automated process, and the stimulus response cycle, the interval gets smaller, so that the cue between the emotional stimulus and the muscle tension happens quicker and quicker and quicker. And eventually, I believe it can happen so quick that it'll interfere with the actual memory of what it is that's upsetting you. And you've effectively repressed the memory out of your consciousness, which is great in some ways, because now we're not feeling what it is that's upsetting us. But the trade-off is that we're walking around with really tense muscles. And the muscles can be kind of arbitrary, depending on what we happen to use at the time. But most common ones are like shoulder tension, abdominal tension, diaphragmatic tension, throat tension, jaw tension is really big. All of those end up carrying the burden of us not feeling and expressing our emotion.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, on top of that, we have all this unaddressed trauma that is negatively affecting the way that we, from like an autonomic place, immediately perceive the emotional and social dynamics of our world and the intention of people around us. And then physically, well, like that could present a lot of physical issues in regards to confrontations and conflicts and such. But physically, we're holding these tension in these places, and that causes an excessive amount of, say, energy, like physical energy, exertion, life force to be held in these places, which then takes away from your body doing things like properly functioning your liver, properly functioning your digestive system, properly uptaking nutrients, proper cellular respiration. And then this would then in time cause damage to the organ systems and such. Does that sound?
Exactly. Because the interference happens largely in the cognitive structures, it doesn't stop the autonomic structures. And so we'll have all the autonomic activation of the emotion going on a lot, as well as the muscle tension, and it's literally kind of burning our bodies out. It's the chronic stress. And so, for example, and I'm not saying that all people who suffer from this condition are because of stress, but it's a good thing to think about. A lot of people in our culture just have cold hands and cold feet. And they'll go, well, I was born that way, or that's just the way I am. Well, cold hands and cold feet are a sign of the fear response. There's a good chance that these people are repressing the fear emotion that's being activated a lot, and they've got the autonomic activation of fear going on in their body, one of the signs of which is, reduced blood flow to the periphery of the body, i.e. cold hands and cold feet.
Interesting. I'm actually holding my foot right now because my toes are cold, but I think it's probably because I'm not wearing socks and my room's a bit chilly. So I want to maybe move this discussion on a little bit, and I'm curious how. So we've talked about the problems that we can come up against. Actually, I have another question first. So in having watched this really fantastic series of DVDs that you have called the Bio-Emotive Framework, which I'll ask you about a little bit more later. You mentioned something about the role of the evolution between suppression, repression, and depression, and I'm just curious if you could go into that a little bit.
Okay. So we talked a little bit about how suppression, which is initially intentional because of the contingencies on our muscle tension, become automatic and become repression. And basically, in a slightly different context, I talk about anger and depression and anxiety and sort of a bio-emotive take on them. And there's a long clinical lure about depression being anger turned inward. And I actually think there's a little bit to that, but that depression is actually a sign of a very complex situation that we've taken ourselves to emotionally. So let's start off with a normal healthy emotional response. You say something to me that hurts my feelings, and I should just cry and express it, and then hopefully you'll be sensitive to my expression and so, oh, I'm sorry, right? And that's kind of the way emotions are supposed to work. But if for whatever reason I get emotionally upset and hurt and I don't express them because I can't be vulnerable, the other option I have is to get angry at the person who hurt me, right? Like if you said something, rather than me putting my attention on how I'm hurt, I can put my attention on the fact that it was you that hurt me and start yelling at you, right? And we see people who have a chronic anger response. And if for some reason I'm not allowed to get angry because you're much stronger than me or you hold a power position over me or something, and it's not okay for me to be vulnerable, now the two main ways of discharging that emotional energy have been thwarted, right? And you say something to me, I get upset, I can't cry, I can't get angry, but I'm really highly activated. It seems like we have a kind of cutoff switch, like a fuse, where my autonomic nervous system, if this is happening day in and day out, says, okay, I'm just going to cut all the energy through the emotional system and not let it flow, because when it does, it just gets like it gets turned on full, but no expression, and that's a danger. It's like running your car at 10,000 RPM with the brakes on, right? It's going to blow something, and so we seem to have a fuse for that particular situation, and the fuse gets blown, and we go into a state of depression, which is like no energy, no relationship to the outside world, not wanting to engage emotionally, because we can't turn our emotional system on without just getting really upset, but it doesn't get discharged, so it just turns off. So it's a kind of dissociation, but it seems specific to shutting the emotional system down because it just never has any positive experiences when it's activated. I don't know how clear that was, but maybe if you ask a couple of questions, I can clarify it.
Well, it does feel clear. I mean, I'm curious about maybe the difference between. Well, there's clinically a lot of different classified types of depression, but to generalize them, I'm curious about the role that like the difference between acute depression and more chronic depression. Because when I think about this, to me, when I look at depression, and this does fit in your model, has to do with some sort of event or series of events wherein the emotional load of it, and I'm going to quote Dr. Devin Christie from one of the previous episodes, the emotional load of it is too much, too soon, too fast, and you're unable to process it properly or integrate it properly, and so your system goes into this defense response and would follow through with what you're saying here in regards to like kind of blowing that fuse, and all of this it initiates like a trauma in the body and in the mind. And that an acute response would be like, okay, it's too much, too soon, too fast. And then you go into this depressed state for a little while. But what that does is shut down things long enough for you to sort of sort things through in a way. And so you're depressed, but it also, there's an opportunity to come back out of it. And this is when things kind of come up really fast, like be it, it's obvious that someone would go through an acute bout of depression after losing someone that they really care about, whether that be, just losing the relationship or actually losing that person physically to death. And then there's a lot of healthy emotional processes that come along with this grief and et cetera. But then I'm thinking about chronic depression and the trauma causing this chronic depression having come from a long time, something that is so far back that, like you said, you had totally repressed the memory, or perhaps you don't even have a memory of it because it happened so early on that the memory is stored in fragments in the emotional brain and has no explicit event to turn to, but it just exists in the body. And I'm curious about I'm just curious if you can go into like the difference between acute depression and chronic depression, and that's going to lead into my next question.
It's an interesting question. It's stimulating a lot of thoughts. I don't normally think about acute and chronic depression, but I appreciate what you were quoting that other doctor is saying, that it's like your system gets overwhelmed and shut down, and then you have the opportunity to sort of reflect on what's going on and hopefully come out of it.
Well, the latter part about reflecting and stuff, that's my interpretation.
That's your interpretation?
As well. Yeah.
Okay. I've actually believed that if something is just repressed and part of your history, that you won't be depressed per se. You'll just have a lot of muscle tension because you're actively keeping those memories repressed when they do get stimulated. But if they're being stimulated in your environment every day, so if I've got an issue that I haven't resolved and it's being triggered on a daily basis, then it's like there's a kind of helplessness that comes about. It's like there's just nothing I can do to address that particular issue, and the depression kind of shows up. I'm just trying to, because I don't usually make that distinction between acute and chronic, but when I see people in depressed states, it's because their issues are being activated on a daily basis, and they don't either cry them out of their system, or, and this is part of the lure with clinical stuff, people will often come out of a depression by allowing themselves to get angry, right? And that's often a stage of healing, is that they'll start, instead of being shut down, the energy starts to move, and it discharges as anger, even though that's not really going to resolve things. At least the energy's moving. Whereas the next step is to move from anger to the hurt and process it, and you'll come out of the depression. So I'm sort of thinking out loud, and maybe you can ask a question to refocus me to see if I'm getting at what you're interested in.
No, this is great. I mean, at this point in the interview, I'm really just picking your brain, because I do find your work very, very intriguing. I have a question now, and again, like, I'm picking your brain here, and this has come up, and I'm curious what role you see transference playing in a person's, say, ongoing activation of depression in their environment or in their relationships, if any role at all.
That's an interesting question. Can I take a few minutes to explain another piece before I address that? Because I don't think it can make sense.
Absolutely.
So I'm going to go back to, I think, a really interesting piece of how the Bio-Emotive Framework emerged. And I'm going to talk about what I call the core feelings. And so if you look at my bio closely, you'll recognize that I was a research and computer kind of geek. And that's how I made my living for 20 plus years. I literally published in like psychometrics and factor analysis and things. I had really no intention of ever becoming a clinician. I really loved research, particularly factor analysis and psychometrics, which is all about pattern recognition. So when I left the university and moved into clinical, largely because I realized I was subsidizing my interest in academia with my consulting practices, I did research on my clinical clients for the first 3 years. Like literally every client that came in, I did a standardized clinical intervention that I knew empirically worked and had a lot of support. And it's actually Gendlin's focusing. And Gendlin really focuses on the body, which is part of what I had been researching. And I literally got people who were upset about whatever variety of situations they're upset about to keep focusing on their body and come up with a word that described the feeling that they were having. And as I did this, the word got more intense, and eventually we found a word that caused them to start crying. So for example, if they're processing something that happened with their boss, and they start off saying, well, I was angry, or I'm pissed off at him, or I was hurt, and then we'd get, I felt betrayed, and then they'd start to cry a little bit, and I'd say, well, does that word capture the entire essence of this situation, or is there anything else that you need? And they'd go, well, it's not just betrayed, I felt worthless, right? And then they'd really start crying. And then I'd sit with them there, and when they finished crying, I said, is that word worthless? You know, when your boss did X and Y to you, you felt worthless. Does that capture the essence of what's happened here? And they'd say yes. Okay, so that we found a word that seemed to capture the essence of what their pain was. And I wrote that word down. And then, you know, go see the next client, and I do the same process. That process was extremely healing for people. But I literally had a separate sheet of paper that I wrote these words down on as I did it. And I did that for 3 years until I stopped getting any new words. So, you know, you've watched the DVDs, but, you know, I'll ask the question, you know, for the readers, like, or the listeners, how many words do you think I had at the end of 3 years?
I'm just going to let that sink in and let you answer it.
Yeah. And it was literally 9 words. And that blew me away. The first year I had about 6. The second year I got another 2. And I got the final one on the third year. But there was a total of 9 words altogether. And it really perplexed me and fascinated me that all of the variety of human experience that we could have came down to these 9 feelings. And that's what I ended up calling core feelings. Now, what's interesting about the core feelings is that they seem to be feelings that we carry with us. And so I'm getting back to the transference stuff. So if, as a child, I was treated in such a way that I felt insignificant and alone, 2 core feelings, insignificant and alone, that's actually really adaptive information, because I know there's nobody really cares about me and nobody's looking after me. So when I get up in the morning, I make my own breakfast, right? Or I know if I get hurt, I have to pick myself up. Whereas if I feel significant and connected and cared for, when I get hurt, I cry and somebody comes and looks after me. So that programming about our relational status and who we are to our group gets impressed in us because it gives us information about what to expect from our group or the world. And so we get those impressions in our system, like insignificant, alone, worthless, inadequate, whatever, and we carry them forward in our life, and now we begin perceiving the world through those feeling impressions. So that same kid who felt insignificant and alone in the family goes to school, and they walk onto the playground and everybody there is having a great time. They don't know anybody. And one of the kids comes over and starts talking to the kid and says, come on and play. But the kid feeling insignificant and alone looks down at the ground and can't make eye contact because they're not used to being engaged in or feeling connected. And after a few minutes of trying, the other kid kind of shrugs his shoulders and runs off to play with her friends and leaves the kid alone. Where that kid, because he brought the feeling of insignificant and alone to the new situation, perpetuated being treated that way and got left alone, right? And that's a kind of gross example of something that we do all the time, and that's a kind of transference where I expect the world to treat me the way I feel, and I'll selectively pick relationships that do that to me. So if I feel, say, worthless, I'll get involved with people who don't respect me. And because it's familiar, I don't reject that relationship, I accept it. And so I continue building relationships into my world that support those feelings, where someone else, when they got the first signs of disrespect, would have said, hey, like, screw you, I'm not hanging out with you anymore. You said you were going to phone me and you didn't. So we either just selectively pick people that fit the feeling impressions we have, or we train people which I'm not going to go into, but I've seen that happen. We train people to treat us the way we feel. And so it's a kind of transference of our early emotional impressions onto all of our future relationships. And then we wonder why we keep living the same patterns of experience over and over and over.
Mm-hmm. Now this, when you, I immediately forgot the word that you used, but moving from transference in the sense of just finding other people to make congruent your internal emotional experience with an external, like, social context. And you had mentioned that sometimes we just find these people, and other times we sort of create it. It really brings up. Are you familiar at all with Stanislav Grof in regards to the COEX systems? So it reminds me of this concept that there are these, like you said, core emotions, and there'll be a central event. Go ahead.
Core feelings. I make big distinction between feelings and emotions.
Okay, cool. I'm going to ask you about that in a second, actually. So these core feelings, and there'll be, in Grof's model, say, sort of blending them here, that there'll be this initial event, and these feelings will come up. And then you'll learn a series of mechanisms or techniques to handle them. Maybe healthy, maybe unhealthy. So if you say you have an unhealthy one and they're not processing properly, and you have these negative core feelings, that every time they come up again in life, like as you mentioned, the boy who had the experience at home and then transferred it over into his experience at school, is that every time these emotions come up, even though, you know, if you were to look at them from a rational continuity, they don't seem to connect necessarily if you don't understand the premise of transference, that each of the times that these emotions come up, they kind of exist in a constellation in your psyche, that all these seemingly disconnected experiences are all associated to the same emotional system, or what Grof calls the systems of condensed experience. I think that's what COEX means, and that you can become activated at some point. And when you're activated, it's like all of the emotions, the cumulative emotional charge from your entire life of having these feelings will come up. And what's interesting, and this is something I think I want to accentuate, because I think people need to think about this, is that we don't just find other people to play these roles to create this congruence between how we perceive ourselves and how we perceive the world emotionally, this inner emotional template, but that we find people sometimes that we can accidentally manipulate into playing those roles for us.
That's what I meant. Yes, we're training them. We train them to treat us a certain way.
And we do this because, and they will do this for us because what we're asking of them, what we're trying to manipulate or training them to be, is something that they are naturally inclined to being because of their own emotional history. And we find ourselves in, and now I'm going into Neil Goldsmith's concept, in these like perfect, like awfully fitting relationships wherein we can externalize or mutually externalize these inner emotional conflicts and replay the roles again and again, the same dynamics again and again to reinforce it. Now, Neil believes that this is an opportunity, once you become conscious of it, to allow it to come up, and then through mutual support and communication really go into where this came from and then change these dynamics. But if we're not conscious of it, if we're not conscious of saying, wait a minute, did that event just happen to me? Did that person do that to me? Or did I accidentally invite them and manipulate them into doing that for me, doing that to me or whatever? So I think that's an important piece to consider.
Very, very much. And it's interesting how you just cited three different, two other people besides myself, all seeing the same phenomena and coming up with interesting insights and explanations for it. I refer to I guess what you're saying, the COEX of Stanislav Grof. I just say simply that all of the situations, all of the memories that have the same core feelings to them are stored in the same place, that we literally organize our memories in some ways by the feeling structures that are inherent in them. So if there's all the situations in which I felt worthless, when I get activated, my entire history of feeling worthless is being activated, which is often why we'll react to a situation in the present time with way more charge than we should, because it's not just that little glance of the eyebrow or the eyes that made me feel a certain way here. It's also reminding me of how I was neglected and mistreated, as a child and at work and all of this. And so all of the energy of feeling dismissed and worthless comes to the fore if we're not completely repressed, right? So,
Go ahead.
And that's something that I actually actively encourage people when they're looking at being upset, is if you can find the core feelings that are being activated, it will give you a great insight as to what's going on with you and why you're reacting the way you are. And it'll start triggering all your history of memories that you can then process, right? So when I'm treating somebody and we find a feeling from work, they'll start processing and crying about that, but then automatically, without me even trying, they'll suddenly be talking about what happened 2 years ago with their boyfriend or girlfriend, and then what happened earlier with had the same feeling as when they were a child that they'd never completely expressed and resolved. And so all of that energy and memory is available for healing in that moment, right? We can literally heal our entire histories through finding one access point. People say, well, I don't like going into the past. And it's like, well, I don't want to go into your past either, but your past is right here in our present. So when it comes up, we'll deal with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's like regardless of whether or not you want to go there, you're carrying it with you into the future constantly. So it's better to carry it with you in a functional, supportive, self-aware, self-learning way than and I can't remember who I'm quoting here. Maybe you can if you recognize the metaphor, but to carry it with you in a functional way rather than carrying it with you in a long, heavy duffel bag where you've shoved all of the shit that you never actually wanted to deal with or knew how to deal with behind you, and you just lug it around for the rest of your life. And then Jung would call that, that what I've described as the duffel bag here is the shadow.
Right.
And,
or the baggage of our, we talk about our emotional baggage.
Right. Yeah. Of course. And one of the things that was coming up, and this is going to be leading into the final question I'm going to ask you, which is not just yet. And it's when asking yourself, this is a technique I like to offer to people who are having, issues in their relationships and that they're getting angry or they're getting upset and they're seemingly acting irrational in their relationships or their partner's acting irrational, is to ask, the feelings that I'm feeling, are they because of the other person, right? Or am I just feeling them, right? And that's a very important distinction, right? Because a lot of times we might wake up one day or something happens at work. We don't even notice these little, these micro changes, and they come up and all of a sudden we're tuned to this emotional charge, to this core feeling as you describe it. And then we'll interact with our partner and they'll do something, or we'll accidentally push them to do something or misperceive what they've done in order to justify those feelings in that other person. And then we blame that person for those feelings, right? And so it could be anger, it could be sadness, it could be, well, I guess sadness is getting more into the emotions. I'll ask you that in a second. But whatever the core feelings come up. And I think the question is, if we're going to use anger as an example, is asking okay, am I angry at that person? Or am I just angry?
Yeah. Anger, and I consider anger one of the emotions, and like 4 emotions, anger, fear, happy, sad, and they're caused by feelings. So if you find yourself being angry at somebody, it's going to be because you have a feeling being triggered, right? And you need to find out what that feeling is, and then say, am I really being treated like I'm worthless, or do I feel worthless? And that's what I'm kind of bringing to the agenda. So often what I'll say is, if somebody makes a communication that's 90% clear or positive and has 10% a little bit dismissive or insensitive, if you happen to be sensitized to feeling insignificant, then you'll pick up, all you'll hear is that 10% of the insensitivity, because it matches with your feeling of insignificance. And so there's another example of being treated like I'm insignificant. And then depending on the person's nature, they can get angry at that person, or they can turn their attention on their own pain and talk about and express feeling insignificant and cry. Right.
And that's where that, like how I mentioned Neil Goldsmith earlier, his premise that, and this is a premise of mine as well, that you can enter into a conscious relationship wherein you're able to say, oh, I'm noticing these feelings, they're coming up, these are my feelings, it was this particular action or comment that you made that triggered them in me, and then from there you can express love and mutual support and start to regress down and go into the crying, going into being held, maybe literally or figuratively, to integrate these emotions a little bit more effectively.
Yeah,
so, and go ahead.
And the trick to that is recognizing that we create our experience in many ways, and it's as soon as it's hard to tell the difference between what we're projecting and what's actually going on there. And so in relationship, the safest thing to do is to own all of your feelings and talk about what you're feeling, as opposed to your inferences about what the other person is doing or saying or feeling. Right? So instead of saying, you're treating me, you're being insensitive, right? Which is, maybe the person isn't being insensitive, maybe they're just really busy, right? Or preoccupied. But instead of saying you're being insensitive and then arguing about that, just say, I'm feeling dismissed, or I'm feeling insignificant. And now, how do you argue about that? Right? And the other person can join you in exploring that. And when you start doing that, what's interesting is each person will find that there's only one or two, usually, of the core feelings that come up over and over and over and over. And it's different for different people. And that's good evidence that, it's not the world that's doing it to us, it's what we're projecting onto the world, or that transference that you talked about. But that's a fairly advanced thing to when you start actually owning and exploring your feelings over and over, you'll find that the same feelings come up over and over and over. And that's a good clue as to what your initial impressions were.
Yeah, I believe this is where a relationship with a therapist, such as yourself, can be really beneficial, because you just get to be there and talk, and you have somebody else who's trained in helping you to explore what's happening there. And it's also holding you in a place that it's like, they're there to support you. Like, as a therapist, your role there is to support that other person in their process of healing. And you can really help with having this feedback, someone paying attention, to isolate what you said, like these one or two things are, and garner a further insight on them. And I also feel like this is something that that a relationship wherein both parties are on the same page, because if they're not on the same page, it's very easy for one person to just continuously manipulate and misuse the other person, and you have to be on the same page with this practice. But you can be in a place in a relationship where you're holding that for each other, right? And then I personally believe, and we didn't talk about spirituality very much at all here, but I believe that a relationship can be, your greatest spiritual practice, because that's when a lot of the inner self work becomes applicable, and you can utilize another person holding you in loving intent to work as a mirror for your own progress, how you go back and bring things up, and then also who you step into in the future.
Certainly. I have come to believe that a relationship with a spiritual partner, if you both take the same orientation towards like using the relationship as a growth opportunity, that it's the most potent crucible of transformation that we actually have available to us.
Yeah, as I said before, I completely agree. I have a lecture that I'd given a couple years ago that's available for free online. I can link it in the show notes for the listeners, called Conscious Relationships, which sort of offers like a very intellectual paradigm to understand how it all unfolds. Now, I want to move on to my last two questions, and you mentioned there being a difference for you between emotions and feelings, and I believe you have different types of feelings that you categorize as well. Can you quickly go into that?
Yeah. So, and you know, here's where I'm making a statement about the world as I've come to see it, and it's really congruent and internally consistent, and it's got a lot of validity in that when people adopt it, it works. So I'm not, and so it's a great heuristic. I'm not saying it's the truth, right? Because to do that, I'd have to do a lot of research and publications, and I'm not in a position to do that. But as I've come to see it, emotions are basically a pre-programmed, genetically based pattern of physiological activity that our body will do once it gets triggered. So we know about the fight-flight response, right? And that's another example of the alexithymia of our culture, where we don't talk about it as the anger-fear response, which it is what it is, right? The fight means anger, the flight means fear. So we have a distinct set of biological activation that dances in the torso of the body that is programmed and is the same across everybody in the human race. Anger, fear look the same. And same thing with happy and sad. They're biological activation patterns that secrete chemicals and hormones and change our physiology to adapt to the situation that's being stimulated. And then those emotions are triggered by feelings. And I just make a distinction between two types of feelings. There's interpersonal feelings and core feelings. So the core feelings are the 9 cores that I came up with that, you know, they're the ones that make us cry or get angry. And then they get triggered by interpersonal feelings. So if while we're talking, you say, if I could see you, you were on your cell phone and sort of looking down at it more than you were looking at me, I would feel neglected or dismissed or ignored, right? Those are interpersonal feelings, and they describe the energy between us. And then that might trigger in me my feelings of insignificance or worthlessness, which if I were in the right environment, I might start crying about, right? Or if I'm not willing to be vulnerable, I could focus my attention on you and get angry at you and say, will you put that damn thing down and look at me, right? And either way, we're trying to resolve the feeling without actually talking about it. So the healthiest thing would be to say, hey, you know, I'm kind of feeling ignored or insignificant while you're on the phone. Do you mind like not using that while we're talking?
And then depending on my response, you can utilize different techniques to establish your boundaries properly and keep yourself healthy, which could include anger and telling me like, that's not okay, get away, you're done, I'm not respected, right?
Yeah, and so the basic pattern that we have is interpersonal feelings like rejection, abandoned, used, abused, which really have intrinsically 2 people involved. It's hard to feel abused without a second person, right? Hard to feel used without a second person. Whereas I can feel worthless just inside myself. So interpersonal feelings cause core feelings, which then elicit the emotions. And that's where I think another insight about the bio-emotive is that I've come to see the emotional brain as a perceptual organ. That in the same way our physical brain perceives light and sound and things, our emotional brain perceives relational status, right? relational dynamics. It's literally trying to perceive my worth or my relationship to the group or the people that I'm connected to, right? It's trying to perceive those dynamics. It's a perceptual thing. That's why feelings are just so subjective and why they can be affected so much by our histories, because they're perceptions.
Mm-hmm. And this would fit in with the triune brain theory. In reading one of the essays that you sent me, you talk about the spiral dynamics integral and the triune brain, and you mention how the emotional brain is the pattern recognizing brain, and so it would make sense that all of your emotions would be organized in these patterns, because the very part of your brain that's perceiving the emotions are the ones that are also, the feelings and such, is the part of your brain that's structurally patterning everything. Yeah, and another thing that was very interesting there is I look a lot about everything that's. Go ahead.
Just in terms of the pattern recognition, if you think about it, when I look at your face and it's in a particular configuration, and I go, oh, I think he's angry, right? Mm-hmm. It's because I'm doing pattern recognition on your eyebrows, your nose, your mouth, your jaw. I'm having to make an inference by looking at a pattern, right? And then I say, oh, he's angry, and that's giving me distant warning signals, right? It's a perception that just looking at your physiology, like just looking at your face doesn't tell me. It's the pattern of your face that tells me something.
Mm-hmm. Which falls into an evolutionary advantage that we developed as mammals when we began cultivating these higher order emotional bonding with each other beyond.
Right. It was like our first glimpses of a theory of mind, where I would make guesses about what's going on inside you, so I could prepare for that as you approached me. Right.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for deepening that. Now, the question there the comment I was going to make was, I find myself looking at a lot of the experiences that are coming up now and always thinking to myself, how does this connect with as far back in my history as to the first time that I experienced these emotions? Because it's the first time I experienced these emotions, which, like you said, are catalyzed by the interpersonal and then the core feelings and the emotions. And what did I learn? What was my learning in that moment? And can I connect with myself now, these emotions, to the very essence of those first emotional trigger in a way that allows me to, release them if need be, but at the very least, come to a fuller understanding of how they're operating in my life. And this distinction between these two types of feelings and the emotions works because I see everything that comes up as being a responsiveness of my infant organism responding to my parental ecology. So how my parents act, or how the parents of all of us have acted, catalyze interpersonal feelings, which then catalyze a core feeling, which would then stimulate an emotion, and then the defense mechanisms and like the strategies of dealing with that initiate at that time. And I mean, that can open up a discussion about how our parents pass along traumas from their past to us, as well as the strategies they employ to either positively or negatively deal with them. Does that fit for you in your model?
Oh, totally. Yes, for sure. You often, as you speak, I hear you using emotions where I think you mean feelings, right?
Mm-hmm. Or at least in your universe.
According to my universe, yeah. Because like the emotional stuff is very broad, like fear, anger, and there's not a lot. I mean, they're very big catch basins to start categorizing your history. But if you go for, hang out with, say, feelings of worthlessness and let yourself go back in time to all the times you felt worthless, you'll see there's a very distinct thread there, unless you were lucky enough not to feel that too often, right? But usually, in fact, that's an exercise that I do with people when I'm in seminars and I don't have a lot of time to do personal one-on-one work, is I'll actually give them a list of the 9 core negative feelings, and I'll just say, I want you to breathe and hang out and say to yourself, I feel X. And then go through each of the 9 core feelings and rate how much your body responds to that statement. And by going through the 9 core feelings, it's really interesting because a group of 20 people will rate so I say rate between 0 and 10. So say perhaps alone gets rated 5 for one person, 10 for another, and 0 for another. And then you go on to insignificant, and it gets rated 3, and someone else rates it a 10, and someone else rates it a 2. Everybody has their own kind of history of resonance, and we can actually discover our kind of core, I call it the emotional psychograph of how we're kind of programmed to perceive the world just by doing this simple exercise of saying the 9 core feelings out as if they're true and seeing how our body responds to it. And sometimes, in the right context, people will just break down crying as they get to the one that's been haunting them for years, but they've never really acknowledged that's what they were feeling. Right? That's how potent actually just finding and saying the words can be.
Mm-hmm. And I want to acknowledge and thank you for the role that you've played in sort of unlocking that for me in my life. After we met and we had some good conversations and I explored your work a little bit more, I did identify at least one of these core feelings that, since being able to identify, I've been able to mitigate its negative effect on how I experience myself and how I engage my world and other people, which was personally, it's a sense of inadequacy. Now, I'm not really necessarily in a place right now where I want to go into unfolding the history of where I see that has come from and all of these things, but I have found this model to be very effective in just learning how to deal and work with my feelings on an everyday, regular, normal process, and so this is in my last question, okay, which is that we've talked a lot about the structure, how it comes up, why it can be positive, why it can be negative in regards to your framework. I'm curious if you could leave the listeners with some applicable practices in order to work in a healthy way with these feelings that come up throughout the course of one's life, throughout their regular day.
Well, that's a great question, and something I actually thought about enough that I was going to offer your listeners. I've just been revamping my website, but I was going to offer, if anyone goes to my website and there'll be a pop-up box for their email and name, but if in the comment section they want to leave your name, like James Jesso, or just something to indicate that they listened to this, then what I'll do is I'll send them a couple templates that I've been using in my clinical practice that steps you through going through the core feelings and finding out which ones you seem to be carrying around with you. And I've got a couple pages of instruction on sort of how to do this. Now, I'm going to put this in the caveat that these exercises can be really powerful. Like, they cut to the core. I actually believe that with those 3 years of research, I actually discovered a kind of our biological visual system for emotions. It's like, I believe that our emotional brain is biologically wired to perceive these 9 core feelings. And if that's the truth, that's why this is so powerful. These cut to the core really quickly. So if someone's going to do these exercises, I hope they're stable, or they have support people, or they've got therapists around to help them, because I wouldn't want someone to open something and just feel completely overwhelmed by it. And I know this sounds like I'm being overly cautious, but I have run across people who do exercises like this and they don't really have the resources to deal with them adequately. So that's kind of my little caveat of please be responsible and sensitive to yourself. And so the exercise is available. I also have a process called Netter, which I explain on that, and it's about notice, experience, differentiate, express, and check for resonance. And you cycle through that until you've actually resolved the feeling. Usually that means you have to cry, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, it's my description of what we all should be doing naturally if we weren't A, repressed, B, distracted, C, dissociated, right? It's a natural process that children do until they kind of learn, not to do it by our culture. So is that okay as an exercise that literally that they can get the template of the 9 core feelings and the rating system and everything?
Yeah, you know what? I think that sounds great. I also feel like it adds a little bit of incentive for the listeners to further investigate your work, because I do feel like it has been very practically valuable. And there's a lot of things that I have found to be very intellectually or conceptually valuable in my study of psychology, and there are a few things that I found to be really practically valuable, and I did find your work to be that. So I guess to conclude the interview, can you offer the links to your website where people will go to access these techniques that you offer, as well as to learn more about the Bio-Emotive Framework, and maybe even to learn more about your practice as a clinician?
Sure, and thank you for those kind words about the distinction that this is very practical, because that's been my goal. When I first got into therapy, one of my goals was to make it more efficient, more to take less time, because I knew of so many therapies that seemed to take forever and didn't necessarily get to the people to the end point. So everything that I have done has been very practical, and it's nice to hear that you found it useful in a practical way. I know it's largely responsible for my own health and well-being. I think I've used these on myself over the years, and it's been extremely useful for me and my relationships. My website is www.bio-emotive-framework, all one word, .com. And it's my second. I'm about to do a third iteration on it. But there's a lot of resources there, and I also have a series of YouTube videos that I haven't posted on my website yet. I thought they were there, but they got lost in the last iteration. But there's a lot of nice videos that give samples of my my DVD material on YouTube, and they're quite useful. And I've sold out all my DVDs, so I decided that I'm not gonna do another batch. So I'm just gonna make them available for streaming and download. So that we're in the middle of doing that. And I'm also gonna probably put a newsletter together where I'll offer to address people's questions on mental health and see how that goes. So it's www.bio-emotive-framework.com. And then there's, if you look up my name or the Bio-Emotive Framework on YouTube, you'll also find some good videos there. And just to clarify, if you put that, if someone signs up and they put your name or this podcast name in the comment box, then I will use that. I'll select them out and I'll send this material to people. Otherwise, I'm just using that name to collect people interested in the newsletter.
Great, cool. So thank you for that reinforcement of that special offer that you've given out to the listeners here. And also, I really look forward to also getting on that newsletter, because I'd be interested in continuing to follow your work. Dr. Douglas Tataryn, thank you for being on ATTMind Radio.
Thank you so much. This was great, and I wish you luck with your future recordings. I've really enjoyed listening to your podcasts.
Great, thank you. For the listeners out there, thank you yet again for tuning in to ATTMind Radio. It's the first time you've heard the podcast. Please go to jameswjesso.com, take a look at the other podcasts that are there, and explore the work, where you can find me on any of your podcast streaming devices through RSS, through Stitcher, or through iTunes with the podcast name ATTMind Radio, ATTMind Radio. And if you've been listening for a while and you like it, please leave a positive comment and a review on iTunes or whatever streaming device you're able to do that on, and help the algorithms help other people find the podcast. And lastly, if you really like it and you want to directly support, head to jameswjesso.com/support, and you can do a financial donation to the podcast. Thank you very much, and everyone listening, have yourself a wonderful day, night, evening, morning, life, till the next episode.